Welcome to episode 4 of the Snobcast. Today, we will be discussing Blue Velvet. As always, this conversation will contain spoilers. We will be discussing the movie from beginning to end. Okay, let's get started. My name's Jeff Bateman, and today I'm here with my fellow snobs, Steve.
Hello.
Joseph.
Hello.
And David. So we wanted to do a David Lynch movie. Why did we choose Blue Velvet?
Blue Velvet is supposed to be considered an American classic, and this is perhaps among David Lynch's more accessible films to mainstream audiences, and it's like a gateway drug, David Lynch film to sort of get people started and introduced to this filmmaker who is really fearless in terms of where he will take audiences. So that's one of the reasons, I think.
So before Blue Velvet, David Lynch did Eraserhead, Elephant Man, and Dune.
3 pretty different movies.
Definitely. And I feel like Eraserhead really is a David Lynch movie. I mean, it's really out there, but this one has David Lynch elements, but it's much more accessible to general audiences, I think.
It's definitely a movie that's locked down to a real physical story that's happening. It's not transitioning into other dream levels and stuff like that.
And The Elephant Man got a lot of attention, but I don't feel like that had as many Lynch qualities in it as Blue Velvet does.
Now, when you say Lynch qualities, what do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking of some of the things. Lynch's love of sounds are very distinctive in Blue Velvet. We have, I can think of the beginning of the movie, there's a part that sticks out to me when the dad is choking on the ground. It cuts to the hose, and we hear the sound of the hose kind of amplified, and there's also a number of shots of that flame going out, and there's a bunch of other examples of just kind of things in the environment whose sounds are amplified. And you definitely see that a lot in Eraserhead, which all the sound in that was done in post-production. And I feel, he did a lot of that too in Blue Velvet. There was even a scene at the end when there was that shootout. There's a piece of glass falling and it hits the wall, and you can tell they added a sound of the glass hitting the wall, and I thought that was very effective.
Well, I think what you were getting at was what makes this movie such a good gateway drug is that it has a story that is grounded in quote-unquote reality, yet it is sprinkled with
still a good representation of his style and of his art.
The story itself isn't original, it's the treatment that's original. Basically, especially watching it this time, you can really notice it. If you've seen it several times, you can really notice it. It's basically just a standard crime story with a David Lynch twist on it, with kind of like an expressionist twist on it. Kind of the big bad tough guy, and the guy that kind of walks between these two worlds, which is the Jeffrey character, and the confrontation, and you're not really sure who's going to win at the end. But that's basically every crime movie made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of 30s, 40s, and 50s, what time period is this movie supposed to exist in?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting, is that it was purposely anachronistic when it was made, but now it kind of makes it seem timeless, with maybe the exception of Laura Dern's hair in a couple scenes. You really can't tell when it was made.
Because sometimes it's 80s and sometimes it's 1950s. I mean, the cars keep changing,
Yeah, there's a lot of classic
time
cars.
period around,
Yeah, a lot.
Definitely. I mean, I feel like there could be a town like that in America right now.
That's kind of stuck in this weird place that hasn't quite updated itself with the rest of the country. Yeah.
But that adds to the Lynch aesthetic, basically. That's kind of part of his decision. It's not kitsch, necessarily, but...
The town of Lumberton does have a personality with the...
Yeah.
You know...
Yeah. I mean, that would be a question since I haven't seen it in so long. I mean, how does it compare against Twin Peaks? How does a place like Lumberton compare to Twin Peaks, another Lynch creation?
I think there are a lot of similarities between Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet in that they both are kind of set in this sort of like aw shucks, like, you know, Leave It to Beaver reality, but underneath is a very dark, you know, dirty place. And it just takes a little bit of scratching at the surface to see that.
Yeah. It feels like Mulholland Drive On, he's making movies where you don't know where reality is or if anything's real or not. Where with Blue Velvet, you are pretty sure that everything you're seeing is real. It's actually happening. It's just weird things are happening in that Lynchian universe.
It's kind of a hyper reality, sort of like Eraserhead. There's things that happen that are unreal, but by doing that, it almost feels more real when you're watching the movie. Like the rape scene, for example, that's really over the top and out of control, but it being that way makes you feel more like you would really feel if you were watching somebody be raped like that. You know, it makes you really uncomfortable. And that's something I think is interesting that I haven't really thought about until watching it this time, is what motivates Jeffrey?
Jeffrey's the audience. Jeffrey...
He's curious.
He's curious, which as a viewer we can kind of relate to. We kind of latch on to Jeffrey because he isn't a freak right out. He seems apparently pretty innocent, pretty average, and we kind of go along with him on this journey. So he's curious. When he hears a story about Dorothy, he's kind of curious, and he kind of wants to explore a little more just out of pure curiosity, and we kind of go along with him on that. And
it's sort of that innocence, that innocent, ignorant position he has, that like, I'm just going to investigate this mystery because I think it's fun.
Because what he finds is like way worse than he could have possibly imagined.
Yeah, he was expecting some kind of Hardy Boys, you know, adventure.
Right, so his like cartoonish Hardy Boys, like just the way he dresses with the suits and the ties and this whole button-up look and persona really brings out Dennis Hopper's insanity.
Like what Dennis Hopper is kind of amplified, you know, by how our palette has been, you know, sort of adjusted, you know, for before he comes into the scene. Hopper starts out kind of feeling out of place, you know, and then he kind of just establishes his presence in the movie.
Yeah, I don't know if you get used to Dennis Hopper, but I don't know if he's more over the top when he's first introduced, or if you just kind of gradually learn what to expect from him. But it's not. He's never quite the same as that first scene that you see him when he enters the apartment.
Well, let's talk about that scene. I mean, can you remember the first time you saw that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember the first time. That was one of the few instances watching a movie where I felt a sense of panic, where I felt like I felt like I want to get out. All right, I want out. And the other time when I felt that was another David Lynch film, which was Wild at Heart, when before Harry Dean Stanton is executed. That was another instance when I felt a genuine sense of panic, and there was just something about the way it was set up, and when that other guy leaves the room. And
leading up to the rape scene, I was already really uncomfortable, like when she makes him strip down and is holding the knife to his throat while she's kneeling in front of him, you know. And I have to say, this is the first time I've seen this movie, so I was pretty surprised by that. And then when Frank Booth comes into the apartment, that sort of just takes it up to a whole nother level of tension that you know, I was already on edge, and then it's sort of...
And that rape scene is really the point where the movie goes off the deep end, you know? Like, you're kind of going with it for a while, and then that happens, and you're like, what did I get into, you know?
It's like the shower scene in Psycho, where you're just so... like, I can't believe the movie's actually going in this direction. This is really disturbing.
He definitely does that on purpose, with the intro being so innocent and pretty. And even though we get that little shot of the Beatles underground and it's all dark and gross, I feel like from that intro, we really don't know what to expect from this movie.
Yeah.
Right. And I think in that scene in particular, Jeffrey is a good representation of what the audience should be feeling, because he is in that closet and he is freaked the fuck out, but at the same time he's kind of into it. He wants to see what happens.
Yeah.
Like he is completely enthralled in what's going on with this mysterious
Jeffrey's a guy
woman.
who's turned on by voyeurism anyway. If
Right.
it wasn't Isabella Rossellini, or what's her character's name?
Dorothy Valance.
If it wasn't Dorothy, he would have been peeking his binoculars into someone else's window, you know?
Right.
And that's kind of like a moment where his voyeurism is kind of turned back on himself, you know? And that scene would not have been as effective if it wasn't shot entirely from the point of view of the closet. If that camera was outside of the closet looking around from all sorts of different perspectives, it wouldn't have had that same effect had it not been from his looking through the blinds and seeing it happen from the closet.
Did you guys know that originally in the script, Dennis Hopper was supposed to be inhaling helium?
And I did.
How weird would that have made? I mean,
That would have maybe been too weird. It would have been very intimidating. And as much as I would like to see that, like, even as an example, like, I'd kind of like to see a part of that scene with, you know, that kind of like
I can understand.
ADR. Yeah.
I can understand why, though. I have a theory why Lynch wanted him to be inhaling helium. Part of the sexual fantasy rape thing seems to be Frank Booth wanting to have sex with his mother. Mommy, baby wants to fuck. To inhale the helium would heighten his own voice and make himself sound younger, allowing himself to be put into the position of being a child in his fantasy.
maybe.
It's a very good explanation. Yeah. I just think, like, all of
Wants
that
to be
aside,
a little boy again. Mommy, baby wants to fuck. You know?
Right. All of that aside, though, it would be just...
It would still be really fucking
It'd
weird.
be way
Would the
creepier.
audience be ready to go that far, you know, already so soon?
That's 0 to 80, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
just in that scene. I think that's why
I
it was
think
kind
it's
of
interesting. Like, yeah, the movie, it could have gone so far that it would have been like a brick wall hitting the audience and they just can't go along any further, you know? It sort of keeps itself just in check enough to allow the audience to slip down with the movie into this realm without putting up a roadblock of nonsense that just stops them before, you know, moving with the movie.
Right, like, could you imagine if, so you had that initial scene with Frank Booth, and then, like, for some reason, Jeffrey gets caught, and they're like, let's go on a ride, and then you have the car ride, like, back to back, and you'd be like, oh, I'm done with this movie.
Yeah.
There's no build-up, there's no tension,
Mm-hmm.
it's not gradual enough, it's just too much kind of thrown at you all at once.
Lynch has a very good sense of what makes people uncomfortable. I don't know if it's fully conscious for him or if it's just the way he is, but he taps into that and he really knows how to push your buttons.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that as right after he does that and pushes your buttons and, you know, freaks you out, he then pulls it back to Sandy with Jeffrey and sort of normalizes you again.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeffrey's response is basically just like, oh, that was, you know, that was crazy. Like, what did I see? You know,
That's one of my favorite parts. And then the morning after, he's talking to Sandy on the phone, and she goes, "How did it go?" He goes, "Oh, it went okay."
I want to say also, there's a real clash of tone, but it's not a clash of tone where it's due to mismanagement when the movie was assembled, which is there's the rape scene with Dennis Hopper, and then we're allowed a good time of breather in between, and then we get to Laura Dern talking about her dream with the robins, and that part is just so innocent and so beautiful with the organ coming in the background, the choir, and the way she's describing her dream about the blue birds and all this love that's surrounding her, and it's like, you know, it's hard to believe that these two moments are in the same movie, you know, but it's a movie that kind of allows itself to have these two polarized worlds of pain and despair and death and dread, and then innocence and hope and love, and it's kind of interesting to see those two worlds juxtaposed against each other in the same movie.
and I think that because Jeffrey is sort of an avatar for the audience, that the way he sort of blends into both of these sort of worlds between these two women that are, one is totally damaged and the other is totally innocent,
Pure, and yeah.
right, and that prevents cognitive dissonance, like, for us,
So,
the viewer.
like, in summary, he doesn't react any way differently than your average audience member with not with schizophrenia would.
Right.
For example. So when you see something horrible, he reacts to that as though it's something that's horrible. If something's confusing, he reacts as though he doesn't know what's going on. Or...
And there's another thing I wanted to mention is some of the acting is funny, but it's almost like it's like intentionally funny, because I think a note I put is that some of the actors are acting like they're acting, with the exception to Jeffrey, which kind of makes Jeffrey feel a little more alone and isolated. It's this town of eccentrics around him that he's not exactly on the same level with. It's always so funny. Like it's kind of strange how when he finds that ear in the field and he brings it to the detective.
That is
right?
such a weird scene.
He's like, "That's a human ear, all right. Here, let's go take a look at it." You know, it's like it just seems so. There's just something weird about it.
It reminded me in tone and structure of how a lot of those B movies from the 50s were set up. Actually, it's the protagonist coming up to the cop and it's like, "Oh, I found this glowing crater thing." He's like, "Yep, that's a glowing crater, all right. Probably Martians."
Yeah,
that type. It had that type of
reacting to things that should have more shock to it with a sort of matter-of-fact kind of reaction.
Yeah, not necessarily like Ed Wood, but that kind of like matter-of-fact type of.
Yeah.
But it's done intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also another line when they're back at the house and Jeffrey says something like, "Oh, being a detective must be fun work." He goes, "Well, it is, but it's also terrible too." And it's like this really ridiculous line.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So with lines like that, I feel like it's intentionally trying to draw attention to genre and to what's to be expected from this specific type of movie. That's why I think it's in there specifically like that. Of course, it does work in terms of the dichotomy between like the good and evil.
Well, I just want to say it establishes genre and then it pulls at the seams of that establishment later on, which is what makes it effective.
There's a lot of expressionist things in there.
Yeah, do you think he uses our expectations of the genre to freak us out?
Yeah. He brought Frank Booth to the Leave It to Beaver world and set him loose in there,
And very gradual. Yeah, it's like he just shows up. I was trying to think of, like, they don't necessarily establish Frank early on, though. Like, for some reason, I kind of remember it like a Mr. Blonde thing where people were kind of talking about him and then he shows up and it's a big deal, but that doesn't really happen with Frank Booth.
No.
He just
she talks to him on the phone.
And you don't really know what the situation is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
You just know there's someone named Frank and he's probably a bad guy.
Okay. Because you see the guy in the yellow suit first.
Right.
Okay.
And then when Frank is revealed, it is the rape scene.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and that's very strange. You really don't have your bearings either. Like what's the situation? What is happening here?
Going back to we were talking about genre. This sort of fits in. Is that the music is very obvious. The emotional cues you're supposed to get from the music is very obvious. During the actual rape, the music goes, and it's like you're supposed to feel bad right now, but it kind of has an ironic effect where it kind of doubles on top of itself in the emotional reaction you get,
Because it's using that like cliche genre music, but it's like it's worse than the music is telling you it is.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is oddly effective. It's a moment that really shouldn't have music in the background. And any other director would probably say, like, this would have more effect if we had no music in the background. To put music in the background on this would be rather tasteless. This would be like a real tasteless thing to put in an emotional cue for music at this point and have it to be obviously cartoonishly, and it does it anyway in the movie. And that's also what's effective and amplifies what's so disturbing about the moment.
But that's a good point, because every single scene in here, probably every shot, is really kind of has his fingerprints on it. If you didn't have score during that scene, it would feel out of place. It'd feel like, oh, you're trying to make Taxi Driver now or something. Everything has to kind of be touched. Like, everything needs to kind of fit within the David Lynch style, especially in this movie. So even though he's telling kind of a conventional story, but he's telling it in his way, it all needs to kind of lead up to that finale.
Yeah, how do you think this story would be if like another director did it?
Really good question.
I think it would be Garden State, except instead of like having a little crisis, he finds an ear,
and it wouldn't show that whole weird rape scene. It would kind of cut away.
I think I know how that scene would have happened if it was done another director. You would have Frank sort of start, and then we just cut to Colin McLaughlin's eyes as we hear what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, in the background, like,
Yeah.
oh no.
But he doesn't react like that. He almost shows no reaction. He doesn't know what to make of what's going on. He's in shock, and that's
Oh yeah, yeah.
and that's how I felt.
His shock is interesting too because it's kind of realistic because that's the first time he's ever seen anything like this before. This is something his world has never experienced. And
Right,
it's
because he's
happened
from the other world. He's
Yeah.
from the Roses and Firemen and
to Leave It to Beaver world.
exactly. And I think as far as genre goes, minus Finding the Ear, I think it begins and it ends as a romance. If you cut out all of the sort of seedy world parts, you would have a 25-minute romance between Laura Dern and Jeffrey.
Which is pretty standard, and a lot of that kind of teen melodrama stuff happens with the boyfriend that she has, and like, you know, oh, I don't want to be seen with him. Like, oh, what will my boyfriend think? And the other girl's something like, oh, he's cute. Oh, gossip, gossip, gossip. You know, all that really just sort of tired, you know, elements. And then at the same time, we keep being driven back into that dark other world where there's fat women and mannequins and
Work lights.
What I thought was interesting, you know, as a noir film, that we don't even meet the damsel in distress until like 30 minutes into the movie, maybe more.
Yeah.
You know, Lynch establishes Laura Dern as the sort of love interest before or of like the Leave It to Beavertown.
Yeah. What makes it complicated also is that this damsel in distress kind of doesn't want to be rescued either.
Right, she wants to be hit.
Yeah. She doesn't want to call the police, you know.
I think that's what makes this movie really hard to watch for some people like Roger Ebert, is that she doesn't really react exactly like we expect a victim to, you know? She almost kind of enjoys it in some scenes, and that may be just because she's gotten used to it and
Yeah.
she's been programmed to feel that way.
Yeah.
But it's very uncomfortable to see that because you want to be on her side, but then you don't understand what she's doing.
The battered housewife syndrome thing, it's tough to do in movies because that's a character that's hard for normal people to relate to, you know, and understand. It's easy to just say, well, why'd you get out of that abusive relationship, you know,
But that's why it works, is because in that world, in that underworld, we don't understand it. We don't understand why Frank has that breathing mask and why he shoves the velvet into his mouth, and
it's a world of violence and nonsense.
Yeah, everything is strange. Like, he has no context for any of it, so we don't have any context for any of it.
Yeah. Like, why does he have to what does that Candy-Colored Clown song do for him that gets him excited? And, you know, what memories is that song triggering?
well, what's interesting
is
is the music he listens to and that he seems to, you know, love on some deep level. I would say is like the music from the other world, from the Leave It to Beaver reality. Does he want that?
It's obviously giving him something else that other people aren't getting out of that music.
You can really kind of come up with a variety of different backgrounds that work for you, but it's on a base level. I think that it's there and it works because that at an immediate level gives the character like some perceived depth. If he was a guy that just came in and was stabbing people and shooting everybody and just raping and stuff like that, it's like, okay, well, this is a cartoon bad guy. But for some reason, when it's like he appreciates pretty music
and he's crying to it too.
It kind of adds some sort of weird humanity to him.
Well, it's like Frank Booth is a fucked up character, but he's a deeply fucked up character.
Yeah. And maybe that adds another level of not being able to understand him as easy, I think. Not in a confusing way, but yeah, just in like a naturally humanistic way. Very much in the same way that Jeffrey reacts more than halfway through the movie, that he can see himself easily turning into a Frank Booth character or being affected by this kind of underworld. Just like you definitely notice with that line where it's like, oh, you're just like me. And then he kind of, when he wakes up the next day, he kind of realizes like this is very possible. Or that there's a definite threat. Like he's not, he could do bad things.
Something I noticed that I wanted to get your guys' take on is the aversion to eye contact, to sight, that I felt mainly the sort of underside characters felt throughout the movie.
Don't you fucking look at me.
Ayo, that's it.
That wasn't a quote. That was him really saying that.
Yeah.
He was just telling you not to look at him.
Nobody look at me. Dorothy says that to Jeffrey, and of course Frank says that a number of times.
I mean, to make an obvious statement, it could have to do with honesty, eye contact and honesty and everything like that. If we were to watch it again, you'd probably notice that like a lot of the Laura Dern stuff is eye to eye contact and stuff like that. And big part of the underworld stuff is like intimidation and things like that.
But I thought Frank Booth was the most honest character in the movie.
Well, how so?
He says fuck a lot.
He does. He does do that. But
I think what you mean is that Frank Booth is a character who makes his motivations rather clear.
Yes.
Frank looks up at Dorothy, says, "Don't you fucking look at me," and hits her. That is while he's in the middle of his baby wants to fuck. Dorothy says, "Don't you look at me," when she's putting her mouth on Kyle, and his looking at her breaks a fantasy she's engaging in. So I think there's some kind of weird sort of rape sexual thing going on involving fantasy, and making eye contact sort of breaks the fantasy that the other person is engaging in.
you kind of get this weird impression too that she's just emulating like what's been done to her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is her line towards the end when she's grasping Jeffrey in Sandy's house?
The disease
you
in
put
me?
the disease in me.
He put his disease.
And what is that disease? Is
I
that
don't know. That's really.
is it the disease of kindness, or
I think it's just that, I don't know, some sort of connection they had, or
I don't know. That line has always kind of flabbergasted me. Like, what is she? Is she just talking about him?
I think it's a way of saying we're emotionally married or something like that.
She's not just talking about him ejaculating inside of her.
That's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, that could be that. Yeah.
I didn't really think of it as like a figurative line, but I guess it could work that way too.
Is Lynch saying anything about sexuality in this movie, or are we just watching characters with strange and destructive and abusive sexual behavior?
Well, that's what I don't know. I don't know if it's like just another device to manipulate the audience, because that's how I interpreted these times that I've seen it. Is like it's something that gets people to react, and that's kind of a direct gateway. Violence and sex, right? It's like a pretty common ground you can use to manipulate an audience for multitude of reasons, and it's really effective in that way. I don't know. What do you think?
I almost want to see like a sequel to Blue Velvet, you know, because like what is Jeffrey and Sandy's like sexual relationship like?
Yeah, are they just going to engage in just like very straight missionary style and then cuddling after that? You picture like, you know, Jeffrey like raising his hand like, oh wait, no, I don't hit you. Like,
I imagine that they have two children, but they are both hatched from very large eggs, like Mork from Mork and Mindy. They don't touch each other. That's my interpretation.
If I could ask a plot related question, if that's cool.
Please.
Why is the yellow man in Dorothy's apartment at the end of the movie with a smashed up skull?
something Frank did to him. I don't know.
So it was Frank that did that?
Yeah, it's Frank.
I never really understood why Frank did that. Is he just cutting off all the ties?
I suppose so, yeah.
I got that impression. Yeah, he's cutting off all the ties. He feels. I don't know if you get the impression that he kind of feels like he was working around behind him or something like that. Like he didn't trust them. And also he kind of wanted to. It feels like he knew that Jeffrey was going to be at the apartment. I don't know. I don't know if it's because he had the police scanner and stuff like that, but I felt like he kind of knew where to find him. And he's
right.
I felt like he wanted it to be found.
And initially, when the yellow man first meets the well-dressed man, is that Frank?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Frank is always
well-dressed man.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I guess well-dressed man is like his liaison. That's his disguise when he meets the cops, I guess. That's his kind of like undercover disguise.
Yeah.
So is the well-dressed man just a red herring? Because I feel like there's some things that are red herrings in this movie too.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about red herrings in general. Like, what else are we looking at?
Yeah, this one in general, it feels like it doesn't get too sidetracked with things that don't add up into the major plot. But I kind of feel like there's details. There's a lot of excessive details, I feel like the thing about the drug dealer that was shot outside the window and the woman that broke her legs. Like, all these things were cooked up, but it really has nothing to do necessarily.
And does that hurt the film?
No.
No. It's all right if that stuff is happening kind of on the sidelines of the movie. That just sort of like it lets you get to know what kind of work Frank does in the world that he's in, and you know.
But don't you feel that way? That there's a lot of detail and a lot of thought out things in all of these things specifically.
Mm-hmm. Any of you guys want to talk about the sort of like the chapters of the movie being bookended by that candle blowing out? Because it happens 4 times in the movie.
Yeah, probably 4 or 5 times.
And that candle isn't referenced like anywhere later. We're like, oh, there's the candle.
No, it's not like he goes to his parents' house and there's that candle.
Mm-hmm. Is that quite literally the movie? Is that candle supposed to be like any kind of light to be shed on any sort of...
Well, it's not like we get any sort of scene at the end with the candle not being blown out or anything, you know. It's like, I think there's that sort of comes from David Lynch's obsession with sound and fire, which we see in a number of his movies.
Yeah.
I think fire kind of represents the chaos and evil of the world.
Wasn't there a part where when Jeffrey hits Dorothy, then we cut to these flames just sort of bursting, you know, out as kind of like an explosion.
With like these distorted roars and stuff.
Mm-hmm. These animalistic kind of sounds, gargoyle-ish sounds are happening. Okay, so did you guys have anything else in your notes that you wanted to talk about? What I want to mention is what I mentioned to you, Jeff, after we saw it in the theater, which was Blue Velvet is cinema at its finest because it successfully manipulates how we think and how we feel. And honestly, that's what cinema is. It's the manipulation of your audience through sound and imagery, and it does it perfectly. You know, and that's one of the things that I think about when I think of the movie Blue Velvet, is that this is cinema at its best. I don't mean that it's dark and disturbing, which makes it its best. It's the fact that it's so effective in manipulating how you think and how you feel, and that kind of opens up the potential of what cinema is capable of. Like, that's why cinema is so great, is because it can take you on this journey and make you feel these feelings and think these thoughts, you know, that few other artistic mediums can do so, you know, that effectively, you know. Definitely. And I feel like Lynch is really the master of just manipulation, you know. He really knows how to, like we said earlier, how to push your buttons. Just one thing I want to mention is this movie, Blue Velvet, has one of my favorite, or maybe my favorite cut in any movie, and that is the I'll fuck anything that moves, and then he disappears with the car engine roaring. I just think that's brilliant. It's so jarring. You know. I can't think of very many cuts that top that. I think Blue Velvet exemplifies why editing is so important. If Blue Velvet weren't edited right, it wouldn't have been as effective. I had my filmmaker's goggles on while I was watching this, especially since I've seen this movie so many other times before, and I'm thinking about like when Frank gets Jeffrey out of the car after Jeffrey punches Frank, and then the cutting around between the reaction shots, and then the woman dancing on top of the roof of the car, and then cutting down to Dorothy screaming and crying, and the music that's happening over. And if this raw footage were in the wrong person's hands, it wouldn't have happened just the same way. That makes you panicked and like, this is really disturbing. Joseph, was there anything you wanted to mention?
I think you got it.
David?
At the end of the movie, as the Robin, representative of love and compassion, holds the beetle, which is representative of evil, in its jaws, crushing it.
Jaws? I'm not sure.
Beak. I'm sorry. In its beak, crushing it. I felt as though my brain was in Lynch's mouth, being crushed. Good show, sir. No, I got nothing.
Well, Just one thing I want to mention really quick that I appreciate about Blue Velvet is that beginning and the end sequence. At the beginning, we see that Leave It to Beaver world. We end with that Leave It to Beaver world too. So it's kind of like we're taking a look at this kind of like a fantasy world. We pull away the veil, which is represented by the insects going down inside the grass and stuff like that, and then we go into this dark, dark, evil world, and then good triumphs at the end. We're allowed out of that evil world, and then we see the same shots of the firemen and then the flowers against the blue sky, and it's kind of like that veil kind of goes right back over. The facade kind of, resumes and it covers, and we can just go ahead and just forget about that world we visited,
Well, but I always think with that final moment with when we hear the clip from Blue Velvet and her staring up into the blue sky, it's like maybe it's not over.
It could come back. It's still, it's just because it's shoved under the rug doesn't mean it doesn't.
Just because Jeffrey's not a part of it anymore doesn't mean it's not still there.
Yeah.
And the line is, I still see Blue Velvet through my tears.
Yeah. It's still out there. It could come back,
There's more evil in the world than Frank Booth.
Yeah. Yeah. The evil that Jeffrey has to deal with isn't just Frank Booth. It's something systemic in the world, It's just personified by Frank Booth, just for one instance. But it's still out there. It can come back.
Thanks for listening to the Snobcast. Please send any feedback to thesnobcastfeedback@gmail.com. Check out our Tumblr, YouTube, and Facebook accounts at username The Snobcast. Next week, we will be discussing the new Nicolas Cage movie, Stolen.